Hey, hey, what's up? Yeah, I just got back from league, just Saturday league. You know, the Nerf league, Nerf gun league. Oh yeah, I've been doing it for a while. Um, no, it's not too far at my house. Yeah, yeah, it's every Saturday at my house. Quite a few people. Quite a few, I said. Yeah, like three other people. Well, we have one guy who's like 7 years old. Another guy who's like 6 years old. We got this new girl. She's like 4 years old. It doesn't matter. I'm not doing it to try to win. No, I could if I wanted to. Yeah, yeah. No, the problem is that they always end up ganging up on me. Yeah, it's like if you ask me, it's some form of ageism. Whatever it is they're doing, I know it's against the Bible. Well, maybe. Okay. Well, you know what? I don't need to talk about this. Okay, I'll see you later. Bye. Come on. Come on. Oh, hello there. Welcome to our next installment of Something Like a Sermon. Today we'll be taking a look at the very end of Luke chapter 24, and that will start towards maybe verse 36, or we could start in verse 44, I suppose, and read through the end of the chapter. I'm going to presume that you've already been through the text. You could start in verse 44 or verse 36, but take some time to read through the text, and we'll spend a few minutes discussing here some of the things that stand out to me, and hopefully some things that will inspire you to think further about the text, or maybe discuss it with some other people. The first three things I want to notice, or sort of the big picture of the text here, is that we're coming to this major moment in the narrative called the Ascension. And for whatever reason, Ascension sort of gets the short end of the stick when we're looking at this triad of important events at the end of the Gospels here. Obviously, most people understand why the cross, why the resurrection is central to the narrative here. But then there's this strange narrative about the ascension, and we're not always so sure what to do with that, how that fits in, what the significance of it is, and maybe we even ask a question. This is a question that I'd invite you to explore. What is the point of the ascension? Why is that part of the central triad to the narrative here, on the same plane as the cross and the resurrection? We also have this ascension. In fact, if all we had were the Gospels, you might think that all of this sort of happened on the same weekend. It's not until we get to Luke's second volume, which is the book of Acts, that we read about this 40-day period in between the resurrection and the ascension. This 40-day period where Jesus is still around, appearing to people. But if you just read even volume 1, the book of Luke, or in other Gospels, you might come away with the idea and be justified in thinking that all this happened on the same weekend: the cross, the resurrection, and the ascension on that same day. So we see the gospel writers, and John does the same thing we talked about a couple of weeks ago with the idea of Pentecost and the giving of the Holy Spirit. He condenses all that into this same narrative as well. So the cross, the resurrection, the ascension, even the events of Pentecost and the giving of the Holy Spirit, those are all intended by the gospel writers to be seen as one large chunk of narrative, and they're all reinforcing some of the same points. Now, they all have distinctions and distinct intense and theological purpose, but they are all meant to be told together. And so that's a question we have to ask then is what is the Ascension doing? What's the point of that? That's sort of the main broad question that I want us to explore. I want you to explore on your own. And I'll try to work around that and see if we can get closer to an answer, but I do want to encourage you to explore that on your own as well. As we enter or move towards the end of Luke's gospel, we see that there's a narrative right before this about the two walking to Emmaus, Jesus appearing to them in the breaking of the bread and that sort of thing. And that leads way to this final section here where Jesus is, in Luke's gospel, there's a strong emphasis on the physicality of the resurrection here, where in verse 36 through 43, he is saying, look, I am flesh and bones. He eats a piece of broiled fish. There is an emphasis on the physicality, the bodily resurrection here of Jesus. There's an emphasis on the presence of Jesus. But then just after that, in verse 44, we have a strange text. And Jesus said to them in verse 44, "These are my words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things which are written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." So that's a strange phrase on the lips of Jesus. He's there with the disciples, but he says, I want to reiterate the words, my words, which I spoke to you while I was still with you. So that's an interesting thing to think about. Something I encourage you to think about. What does Jesus mean when he says, while I was still with you, even though he's standing right there? Why is that phrase in Luke's gospel? What could he mean by that? Is there a difference? Is there some sort of difference between the way that Jesus used to be with his disciples and the way he is now? Or maybe this is something that we'll see as the text moves forward here, that a lot of this is actually in service of the church. In other words, the story that we're hearing here isn't just meant to give a record of stuff that happened. It's meant to be an encouragement and an inspiration for the church of Luke's day and for the experiences that they are going through. In other words, the church who receives this gospel is a church that is generations after Jesus, a church who has never been eyewitness to Jesus, never were his disciples who walked around with him throughout the lands. And so it's important and maybe written from their perspective when we hear these sorts of words, while I was still with you. We see that same sort of emphasis as Luke drives home this message of asking a question after the death and resurrection of Jesus, asking a question for the church of his day. How do we encounter Jesus? How do we, as a church today, and how does the world today encounter Jesus? If he's not here anymore, if he has been resurrected and ascended, and we don't see him and encounter him in the way that his disciples used to, how do we do that? How do we encounter Jesus? And one way that we saw with the road to Emmaus is that we, part of the message to the church there is that we encounter Jesus in the breaking of the bread. We encounter Jesus when we open our home to a stranger. Those are all important messages for the church. It's not just about a record of what Jesus did. It's a message for the church of how they can encounter Christ in the same way. So too in the rest of Luke 24. How does the world encounter Christ? Where do we see him? Part of that is in verse 48, in the witness. Part of it is in verse 49, in the waiting. And part of it is in the last little section of Luke's gospel, in the worship. the witness, the waiting, the worship. Those are the ways that Luke is highlighting that the church, and by extension the world, comes to know and encounter Christ after the ascension. But he shows that he gives that message to the church in the telling of this narrative about the disciples in their last moments with Jesus prior to his ascension. So he says to them in verse 48, he takes them out to the place where he's the mountain, the hill where he's going to, from which he will ascend, and he says, "You are witnesses of these things." This is tracking right along with what happens in Luke chapter 1, talking to them about being a witness. And in the witness of and the testimony of these disciples, people will encounter Christ in some way. And that's part of what Luke is trying to say, trying to help the church understand. Also, in the waiting, in verse 49, Jesus says, "I'm going to send forth the promise of my Father upon you." He's talking about the Spirit. "But you should stay in the city until you're clothed with power from on high." Wait until you're clothed with power. Same exact thing happens in in Acts chapter 1, and he actually uses the word for waiting there. So there is a way that we are going to encounter Christ in the waiting. This is the experience of Luke's readers of the church. They don't encounter Jesus personally like the original disciples did. They encounter him in the waiting. There's a waiting for the promise and the blessings of Jesus to be fulfilled, and that's the experience of the church. So it's an important message. We encounter Jesus in the witness, in the waiting, something that's very relevant to us over the last couple of months. Maybe waiting is the hardest one, because we want to get to the worship part. That's the next one, right? We know how to encounter Christ in worship. Let's do that. But there's an important way to encounter Christ in the waiting as well. And that's certainly the most challenging one for the church. It has been, always has been. And we kind of know that personally lately as our worship has taken a different form, and there's been a lot of waiting on the part of the church in the last couple of months. But waiting is an important part of Christianity and an important part of the experience of the church. And the church needs to learn how to encounter Christ in the waiting as well, not just in the witness, not just in the worship. But of course, the worship is an important part of it. Here at the end of Luke's gospel, the last few verses ends on that note. He leads them out as far as Bethany. He lifts up his hands to bless them. This is sort of a priestly scene, this priestly blessing that Jesus gives them. And the way that the narrative is structured here is kind of like one of those slow motion scenes, and this continual blessing. The way that it is told grammatically, it's sort of like this slow motion, never-ending blessing, sort of this infinitive, continual state of blessing on the church by the hands of Christ. Even though he ascends and goes away, it's sort of like that blessing doesn't end. It's in a continual, perpetual state, even as Jesus goes out of sight here. And then, of course, they worship him in verse 52 and continue to do so in verse 53, continually in the temple, blessing God. So God's blessing is poured out on them. They reciprocate that blessing in the temple through worship. And off we go, turning the page to Acts chapter 1. And now we see just what that power is that Jesus and the Father had promised the church, and that power of the Spirit, and how that is meant to change the world. So that's the message here: the witness, the waiting, and the worship. That's the narrative of the ascension, and that's what that message is about. Jesus is not here in the same way he once was. He is ascended. We want to ask the question, what does that mean? What is the theological point being made in the ascension? Why not just stay here forever? Why not just stay here and the resurrected Lord could be here for a million years or however long humanity is around on this earth, he could appear to every generation like that. What is the why not do that? What's the significance of the ascension? What is the import here? Why is it necessary? What happens in light of the ascension? That's what the book of Acts is about. It has something to do with the witness, and of course the waiting, and obviously the worship as well, and ultimately with the blessing, which comes in large part in the form of the Holy Spirit. But we want to ask that question: what is the point of the ascension? I want to invite you to explore that more on your own. We kind of have looked at it a little bit here. And then this question that we looked at in verse 44, Jesus says, while I was still with you, even though he's standing right there in front of them, yet he talks about as if he used to be with them in a different way than what he is now. And we know that to be true as the church. And what is the significance and meaning of that phrase? And how does that play out in our experience as Christians today? What is the difference between encountering Jesus in the first century and how we know and encounter him today in the 21st century? And finally, I think one of the keys when we're asking questions about the ascension in general, about Luke chapter 24, the ending here, about Acts chapter 1, all these texts and other texts besides in the Gospels, one of the keys to unlocking this is this really interesting narrative in 2 Kings chapter 2. And of all the things that I'm inviting you to do and to look at today, I think this one is maybe the most important. I want to invite you to spend some time reading the narrative in 2 Kings chapter 2. And when you read that, don't read, I guess you can read as far as you want, but just be careful when you get to the end there. But 2 Kings chapter 2 is a really powerful narrative, and I want you to read it in light of the events that are happening in Luke 24, in Acts chapter 1, about the ascension, and you will see that Luke is tracking with this narrative of Elijah and Elisha. And the things that are happening in that narrative, in that text, are meant to be parallel with the things that are happening in the ministry, in the life, and in this case, the ascension of Jesus. That Elijah and Elisha narrative has powerful parallels in a lot of different places in the gospel narratives, but especially here in this ascension narrative. So I want to invite you to spend some time in 2 Kings chapter 2, read about that Elijah and Elisha narrative, and be thinking, what is Luke trying to tell the church about Jesus and about the church in the aftermath of Jesus' ascension? Because the message of 2 Kings chapter 2 and what's happening there is the same message that Luke is trying to communicate here, the same picture that he's trying to paint as he tells the story of Jesus' ascension. So that's the final thing, that answer key to the text that we see in 2 Kings chapter 2. Read through that, ask those questions, what are the parallels here, and I trust that will be a blessing to you on this Lord's Day.